It's time to raise those spirits. The Necromancer returns from the dead in Diablo 4. My name is Codiak, this is Legacy Gaming, and after 15 hours with the Necromancer during the game's open beta, we're here to share our honest impressions of the class. As a master of darkness, corruption, bone, and blood, the Necromancer in Diablo 4 feels both familiar and new, as you summon a horde of undead minions to make Sanctuary a living hell. It's a class you'll likely gravitate towards if you not only enjoy a minion-based class, but one that can also flex to a more traditional DPS class while foregoing those aforementioned minions entirely. While the Necromancer did come across as insanely overpowered in many instances during the open beta, don't forget all of these classes were capped at level 25, most systems and content were heavily limited, and the difficulty of whatever Diablo 4's endgame shapes up to be hasn't even been tested by the public. Everything overpowered during this little snapshot can change drastically come the full launch. As is standard with each class, you'll build up and manage a class resource. In the case of the Necromancer, it's called Essence. While the class has the same starting loop for generating essence between your basic and core skills, the class quickly opens up to take advantage of all the corpses on the battlefield to keep you topped off at all times, allowing you to constantly take advantage of the Necromancer's potent skill library. Corpse skills allow you to take advantage of the deceased to rapidly remove enemies from the land of the living. Macabre skills tap into blood and bone to manipulate and control the flow of battle. Curse skills afflict debilitating effects upon your foes such as slows, damage over times, and even damage mitigation, all while helping you sustain your own life pool. Lastly, we can't forget about the Necromancer's ultimate skills. Waves of blood, mass resurrection, and tornadoes of sharp bone fragments not only look incredible, but synergize incredibly well with the rest of the Necromancer's potential kit. After reaching level 25, Livid did his due diligence and experimented with numerous builds while optimizing a full set of potent legendary gear, so I think it's time we dive into what makes the Necromancer special. Now we're just going to be upfront here. The class is absolutely overpowered, at least at this point. I think everyone who's played the class has come to that same conclusion, even during the leveling stage. Unlike most players, when a class is that overpowered, Livid really does have a hard time truly enjoying it because experiencing the content and mechanics in the game with said class is half the fun. It legitimately made most of the content a complete joke. You could pretty much ignore 99% of all boss mechanics and just let your minions wail away on the target while you rapidly detonate the corpses that spawned. It's comically strong, but as I said before, we had limited access to the game, and that could be a huge factor. This doesn't mean the Necromancer itself isn't fun. In fact, it's the opposite. The Necromancer is probably the most enjoyable class in Diablo 4 by a mile. Every ability feels incredibly responsive, and while you yourself aren't fast, your abilities feel like they can adjust and snap to whatever the current threat might be at a moment's notice. The Necromancer is also probably one of, if not the best, leveling class so far. The skeletal warriors alone feel like miniature barbarians, both soaking up and dishing out really decent damage, all while holding aggro on anything in your path. You would also think in single target scenarios, the Necromancer's minions would fall off due to a lack of corpses to spawn new ones from as they die, but that's not the case either. The rate at which corpses drop off enemies by simply attacking them due to certain passives in your skill tree is absurd and allows you to keep this undead army up indefinitely. Don't get me wrong, a minion-based build is incredibly fun, but at a certain point, you end up with not a single threat source to your life on the battlefield. Hopefully, this all comes into line once the full game launches and we have access to the hardest tiers of content, so we'll reserve full judgment on that for now. By level 25, the vision of what the Necromancer could become wasn't much clearer than while we were leveling it. It's incredibly strong, and in terms of positive takeaways, we'd have to say the Necro is capable of holding aggro via its minions, not only during solo play, but in groups as well. Even though the Golem by default has a manual taunt effect, the skeletal mages and warriors seem to naturally pull enemies to them before they even get a chance to engage you. This gives you numerous options within various summoner builds to provide valuable utility with little risk. Because of this, the Necromancer can also reliably handle hordes and single target encounters equally well. The class also has incredible essence sustain via corpse generation and corpse explosion. There was never a moment where we didn't see at least 10 bodies on the ground, each one providing a massive amount of essence upon consumption. This allows all other skills to be used with little regard to what they cost. With that incredible sustain also comes incredible burst damage. No other class we used during the beta, aside from maybe the Sorcerer, was able to blow up bosses as fast as the Necromancer. Now, we always try and play both sides of the equation here when it comes to evaluating mechanics in classes, and we'll be honest, there are little to no weaknesses on the Necromancer, at least at this point in the game. This can and likely will change come full launch, and we might even see gear be the real determining factor for an effective Necromancer at endgame, more so than other classes. That being said, mobility is probably the biggest issue for the Necro. You don't have any standout abilities aside from Blood Mist to get you out of a sticky situation. Even then, it's incredibly niche, and if your minion walls do fail at later difficulties, this might become a major pain point for the class. Now, I think it's time we dive into what really makes the Necromancer stand out in Diablo 4, its unique class mechanic, Book of the Dead. This offers unprecedented control over which types of skeletal warriors, mages, and golems join you on the battlefield. The cool thing, if you want to run a build that doesn't utilize summons at all, you can choose to sacrifice them to gain a passive buff. Warriors are your melee-wielding undead and are often the first summons to fall in battle. These have 3 variations. Skirmishers are sword-wielding minions that deal increased damage at the cost of reduced total life. From here, you can choose to either upgrade that, either raising 1 additional skirmisher, making your skirmishers critically strike after you land a critical hit yourself, or sacrifice them altogether to increase your base critical strike chance. Defenders forego that increased damage and instead have an increased total life. In terms of upgrades, you can make it so your defenders periodically negate instances of damage, increase the amount of thorns they inherit from your character, or sacrifice them to gain a buff to your non-physical resistance. Finally, Reapers, our personal favorite, wield a powerful scythe that deals heavy damage after a special wind-up attack. For these, you can further reduce their special attack cooldown if attacking status-affected enemies, have a chance of forming a corpse for every basic attack they land, or sacrifice them to gain an increase to your shadow damage. Then you have your skeletal mages, which are fewer in numbers but have a ranged attack as well as a heal. These also have 3 variations. Shadow mages attack at range, dealing moderate shadow damage. In terms of upgrades, you can either give them a chance to periodically stun their targets, fire an additional shadow bolt after a set number of attacks, or sacrifice them to increase your total essence pool by a set amount. Cold mages will chill and eventually freeze enemies in their tracks. For upgrades, you can either generate essence off of their attacks, make frozen enemies vulnerable when damaged by your mages, or sacrifice them to gain an increase to your damage to vulnerable enemies. Finally, Bone Mages. These deal damage at the cost of their own life. For these, you can either lower the life cost per attack and amp their damage after a set amount of time on the battlefield, generate a corpse and fortify you on death, or sacrifice them and massively boost your overpowered damage. Last up, we have Golems, and while we know there are Bone, Blood, and Iron variants, we only had access to the Bone Golems during the test. These not only operate on an entirely different summon skill, but are able to taunt enemies into attacking them in a massive AoE. For upgrades, you can either shed a corpse every time your golem loses a set amount of life, increase its total life pool and the amount of thorns it inherits from you, or sacrifice it entirely and gain a boost to your overall attack speed. The cool thing about the Book of the Dead is the sheer amount of flexibility this provides your minions when experimenting with vastly different builds for the Necromancer. Even some of your ultimates, such as Army of the Dead, feeds off your summons, eventually allowing you to mass resurrect your army in the blink of an eye. Overall, this is a super customizable system that also lets the developers expand your minions' functionality long-term, and to us, that's super cool. Throughout our time with the open beta, we tried to ensure we actively tested classes in both solo and group content, and just like most other classes, group play can allow you to take skills or effects you otherwise wouldn't consider, since a teammate can likely cover the weakness it would put in your build. That being said, the Necromancer seems to be able to cover just about any role there is, both solo and in a group. It does fantastic DPS through things like Blood Surge, Corpse Explosion, and various bone skills. It's able to tank massive amounts of enemies and even bosses with sustain between your minions and damage-reducing debuffs, and it's even able to control entire groups of enemies through things like Bone Prison, Corpse Tendrils, and slow debuffs in your Decrepify Curse. Seriously, if you need a role filled or want to enjoy the solo grind experience, the Necromancer quite literally has it all. I would say it's even a bit oppressive in group content, and we were actually worried quite often that it would kill hordes of enemies so quickly that everybody else would get bored. Again, we're sure things will change later at the full release, but it's worth reiterating. Before we wrap up, we want to touch on build potential of the Necromancer. Because of the ability to sacrifice your summons to provide substantial passive bonuses to the class, it allows the Necromancer to potentially dive much deeper into specific skill trees like Bone, Blood, and Shadow. Things like spreading blight from your core abilities and even corpses allow you to quickly populate the battlefield with toxic pools. Bone allows you to spec into critical chance and critical damage, all while trapping enemies inside of a prison to make them vulnerable. Even Blood has ways of rapidly bursting down entire groups of enemies around you, all while generating healing orbs, allowing you to lean into overpower damage. All of these strategies seem viable both with and without minions, and doesn't even factor in some crazy aspects that allow your abilities to echo or spread to other targets naturally. Even though the Necromancer appears overpowered, the build potential feels expansive. We're here for it. Hopefully now you have a better understanding of our experience with the Necromancer in Diablo 4. Anyone who loves high burst damage or summon-based classes will fall in love. It's fantastic at keeping aggro off both yourself and teammates, while carving through enemies at a ridiculous pace. The team has done a decent job of sprinkling in some other unique skills that give you some variety in your builds, despite the kit having much more passive investment than other skill trees. While the class overall feels incredibly overpowered, ultimately it's important to ask, is the Necromancer fun to play? And our simple answer is yes. Friends, we hope you're enjoying our Diablo 4 coverage. While content was limited during the open beta, we look forward to checking out and creating even more videos when the game goes live on June 6th. As always, if Diablo is on your radar and you want more content like this, including deeper guides and eventually some fun builds, hit that like button and consider subscribing. We also plan on opening up a Diablo 4 clan once the game goes live on June 6th, so if that's something you're interested in, consider joining the Legacy Gaming community on Discord. Our open beta clan filled up in one day, so keep an eye on the chat and be sure to stay tuned for more information come launch. My name is Codiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching and play on.